Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Fun with Maps. I'm your host Dan Hansen. If you remember the last episode, I got the song Bangladesh by George Harrison stuck in my head. You know, because we looked at the map of Bangladesh and I couldn't get rid of it. Now I have another song stuck already. It's from U2's Rattle and Hum album. It's called Van Diemen's Land. And that's the map we're going to look at today, but it's not called that anymore. It's not Van Diemen's Land anymore. So let's just start with a little counting. And this is, one of the reasons we do Fun with Maps is I'm not sure that people know enough about the world around them. I don't know if we were taught in school or we've lost some of that. But by knowing about the world as the world shrinks, we can learn about the people, and that's really important. We can get along and know about their culture and past and people and what the maps can tell us about that. So let's start with a little counting. Obviously, we all know, I hope you know, at least here in the U.S., that there's 50 states in the United States, right? Hopefully everyone knows that. But do you know how many provinces are in Canada, for example? That's a little tougher depending on where you are in the world. So Canada has 10 provinces and 3 territories, okay? Let's see, what else? All right, Ireland, for example. Ireland's a small country, but it's got 32 counties, 6 of which are in what's called Northern Ireland. But there's 32 counties on the island of Ireland. What else? How about Mexico? There's 32 federal entities in Mexico. So you have 31 states, and then Mexico City is like the 32nd. It's a separate entity. It's not formally a state. So what about Australia? Australia has 6 states, 10 federal territories. So you got states of New South Wales, Queensland, South Australia, Victoria, Western Australia, and the topic of this episode of Fun with Maps, which is Tasmania. Okay, Tasmania is an island state in Australia. It's about 150 miles to the south of the Australian mainland. It's separated by something called the Bass Strait, and we're going to look at that. It's a pretty interesting story. It's an archipelago, and remember, an archipelago is just a stretch of water containing many islands. So the largest island in Tasmania is the island of Tasmania, but there's a lot of other ones. Tasmania itself is the 26th largest island in the world, and it's surrounded by probably 1,000 other islands. So Tasmania is the southernmost part of Australia, as we'll see. It's really interesting. It's got some unique flora and fauna. So what's all this about Van Diemen's Land and the U2 song and all? Well, you'll see as we get into this episode of Fun with Maps. And I got to tell you, stay tuned. We have a very special guest who's been to Tasmania and lives in Melbourne, Australia now. And he's going to be joining us and tell us a little about his experience with Tasmania. So here's a map of around Australia, Oceania, Southeast Asia there. So of course here in blue is Australia. Up here we got New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, the Philippines, Indonesia, Southeast Asia, the peninsula here and all. Over here is New Zealand, okay? And of course this is Australia. This down here is Tasmania, okay? It's an island state. It's located off the southern coast of Australia, obviously. Southern hemisphere, eastern hemisphere. So it's got the Indian Ocean on the west here, the Tasman Sea over here in the east. This, as we'll see, is a shallow Bass Strait that separates Australia from the mainland here. Okay, this has a little more detail on this map. So again, here's New Zealand down here, Australia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Marshall Islands, Tonga, Tuvalu, a lot of these things we've covered and seen before. The Pitcairn Islands way over there. But here's the Indian Ocean, here's the Tasman Sea, South Pacific Ocean over here, and this is Tasmania down here. What you can see right away is how it fits into the mainland across the Bass Strait. So over time tens of thousands of years, this was probably connected here, just as New Zealand was probably connected to the mainland here too. So here we zoom in a little more on just Australia here, and of course there's Papua New Guinea and Indonesia and New Zealand would be over here. But here's Tasmania here, and here's this Bass Strait. Here's Australia, the Tasman Sea, Indian Ocean. We're going to do a separate Fun with Maps episode about Australia sometime because it's so fascinating, but let's take a quick look. You know, most of the world knows about Sydney down here. It's the most populous. We've all seen pictures of the Sydney Opera House. It's in the state, there's 6 states as we said of Australia. It's in the state of New South Wales, pardon me. Okay, the next largest city is Melbourne. Okay, that's down here, and that's where our special guest in a later episode is going to be from. And Melbourne is in the state of Victoria. So here's Melbourne. Next comes Perth, way over here in the western Australia. Okay, next most populous is Adelaide, which is here in South Australia. Okay, there's Adelaide. And then this 6th most populous is Hobart here, the capital of Tasmania, and that's down here. So you can see they're all along this area, the most populous, way over at Perth. So this is a nice NASA map of Tasmania. It shows some of the, you know, different elevations and flora and fauna and all. What's interesting here is the shape. Some people say it's the shape of, it's basically a downward facing triangle, right? Some say it's like a shield or a heart or an apple. It's called the Apple Isle, or even a face. So, you know, what do you think when you look at this? That's Tasmania. Back to this map, you know, evidence indicates the presence of Aboriginal people about 42,000 years ago in Tasmania here, okay? So they're thinking the rising sea levels cut Tasmania off from the mainland of Australia about 10,000 years ago. So this was connected, and you had these rising sea levels. It was probably connected until the last glacial period, about 12,000 years ago. And this the rising sea levels formed this body of water here called the Bass Strait. As of now, it's about 150 miles here, 150 miles from the mainland. So here's another good map. You can see here's all of Tasmania. Up here is Flinders Island, King Island up here, Hobart, the capital, down here. Launceston is the second biggest here. And here's the Bass Strait. So a guy named Matthew Flinders, and there's Flinders up there, and George Bass, for Bass Strait, they sailed through this in 1798, and that was the first time that anyone really knew that Tasmania was an island. So that's Flinders and Bass. And as you can see from this very old map, you know, when Tasmania was still called Van Diemen's Land, which we'll talk about soon, up here it says Bass's Strait. So it was named after Bass, George Bass. They called it Bass's Strait originally, and it got reduced to Bass Strait here in Van Diemen's Land. So if we look at the geography of Tasmania here, you know, it's divided into several distinct regions. So you've got the West Coast, right? You got the Central Plateau, sometimes called the Central Highlands. You've got the Midlands here. Here's Southern Midlands. Here's Northern Midlands. East Coast, of course, and the Southeast. And each of these regions feature unique topography, climate, and natural features. So, like the West Coast here of Tasmania, it's predominantly rugged, mountainous, dense rainforest, steep terrain. It's got a lot of minerals, so it was a big mining area here. The Central Plateau, or also known as Central Highlands, it's an elevated region, about 3,000 feet above sea level. It's got a bunch of alpine vegetation and several glacial lakes here, as you can see. The Midlands, your southern and northern Midlands, they're basically flat, good agricultural landscape. They're a little drier and warmer compared to the West Coast, so this is where the farming would be. And the East Coast, you can tell, look at it's the coastline, the white sandy beaches, the mild climate. This is the Freycinet Peninsula here, okay, hanging there, and that's a popular tourist destination, and they've got a scenic national park there, Freycinet. And then you got this southeast region, which is home to the state capital here of Hobart, and that's along the Derwent River. And that's got a mix. You know, there's coastal landscapes. You can see all the bays and keys and all that here. The landscape's rugged, mountainous terrain. And over here is the Tasman Peninsula, you know, which has some towering sea cliffs and a lot of unique rock formations. So this is Abel Tasman, and you guessed it, Tasmania is named after him, Abel Tasman. He was a Dutch explorer. He made the first reported European sighting of the island back in 1642. Tasman himself, though, didn't name it after himself. He named the island after his sponsor, who was the governor of the Dutch East Indies, and his name was Anthony van Diemen. So they called it Anthony van Diemen's Land, and later they shortened that to Van Diemen's Land. You know, the British did that. This is an old map from 1663 of, you know, what they called Van Diemen's Land back there. So Terre de Diemens, discovered the 24th of November 1642, and here it's Anthony van Diemen's Land. You can see that. So this map shows some of the parts discovered by Abel Tasman, including Storm Bay down here, and Maria Island, and Schouten Island, which is, you know, we saw that peninsula before. At the bottom of that peninsula is this Schouten Island here. Okay, so Tasmania was permanently settled by Europeans in 1803. It was a penal settlement for the British Empire. They didn't want the French to get it during the Napoleonic Wars. At the time, the Aboriginal population was about, you know, from 3,000 to 7,000 people, but that was almost wiped out completely within 30 years. There was disease and war, what they called the Black War. So they were under British rule, and the island was initially part of the colony of New South Wales, but it became a separate colony under the name Van Diemen's Land in 1825. And they sent about 80,000 convicts that were sent to Van Diemen's Land before this practice, which they called transportation, stopped in 1853. Let me digress a second with a Fun with Maps fact. So this is the cover of the U2 album Rattle and Hum, the Irish band. The Edge here, usually Bono sings, but this is the Edge. He sings lead on a song called Van Diemen's Land, which is based on an old Scottish folk song, The River is Wide. And it's about John Boyle O'Reilly, who was the leader of an 1864 Irish uprising after the Great Famine. He was banished to Australia for rebelling against the government, and, you know, most British convicts were sent to what was then Van Diemen's Land. There's also a traditional Irish song called Van Diemen's Land about 3 poachers who were sentenced there to 14 years of penal servitude in Van Diemen's Land. So this is a map from 1852 of what, you know, still called Van Diemen's Land. And here's the Bass Strait up here. Here's Launceston, and Hobart's down here, and there's Schouten Island, and, you know, some of these things we've covered. Here's the shape here. If you can't see, that's our shape of Tasmania. So remember, Ireland was part of the British Empire during the 19th century, and when there were criminals who broke the law, they didn't want to necessarily send them to jail or hang them if it was a grievous offense. Britain started sentencing them to years of hard labor in their new colonies here in Australia. And like I say, they called that transportation, and they thought it was a more humane way of dealing with some of these who were criminals, some who weren't. And it's also, it gave an endless supply of free labor. You know, never forget that part. The conditions, I guess, in the convict colonies were far from humane. Harsh treatment, exhausting work. A lot of the convicts died long before they completed their sentence. About 75,000 convicts were transported to Van Diemen's Land the first half of the 19th century. So down here, here's the bigger map to show where we are. Here's Tasmania, and here's the area we're looking at. This is Hobart. Hobart is the capital and most populous city of Tasmania. So in 1804, a second settlement, a penal settlement, was established in Sullivan's Cove, on the western side of the Derwent River. There's more water there. And this settlement became known as Hobart Town, or Hobarton, later shortened to Hobart, after the British colonial secretary of the time, Lord Hobart. Okay. Today, Hobart is home to about half of all Tasmanians. Its skyline is dominated by Mount Wellington, which is over 4,000 feet. This is an 1834 painting by John Glover. It's showing this is Mount Wellington, and this is Hobart Town from Kangaroo Point. And then these are supposedly Aboriginal Tasmanians dancing there in the foreground, and swimming. But that's Mount Wellington, and this is how they painted Hobart Town back then. And Hobart is Australia's second oldest capital city after Sydney, which is, as we said, in New South Wales. So here's a fun with maps fact too. The port of Hobart is the second deepest natural port in the world, second only Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. And the 2021 census, there are about 250,000 people in the greater Hobart. The city itself, the local government area, had about 55,000 people. So Tasmania itself, while Britain was sending convicts to Australia, about 75,000 of those, about 4 out of every 10, were transported to Tasmania. And what happened then is settlers started coming in, because you got there's promise of land grants, and you had all this free convict labor. So they were using that to build up the country, and settlers started to come in. So then in 1855, the Constitution of Tasmania was enacted. In 1901, the colony of Tasmania united with the 5 other Australian colonies to form the Commonwealth of Australia. And Tasmanians voted in favor of this with the largest majority of all the colonies, so they were really into this Commonwealth of Australia. There's a ton of interesting history about Tasmania and Australia, even broader, but that's really beyond the scope of Fun with Maps. But I will say a couple details about it. It's the largest island in Australia. It's about 26,000 square miles. It's in the path of this notorious roaring 40s. It's a wind that encircles the globe and causes all kinds of problems. So this is a CIA map of the Antarctic region. You can see, okay, here's Australia down here. Here's Tasmania, because it's kind of flipped around. New Zealand. Here you've got South America, Argentina, and Chile. And right around the circle here, New Zealand, Chile, Argentina, Norway, all that. So Tasmania here is Australia's chief sea link to Antarctica. And their Hobart itself is home port for the French Astrolabe, and they go regularly to the Southern Territories near and in Antarctica. This is a bust of Roald Amundsen, and it's at the Institute for Marine and Antarctic Studies in Hobart. And he's a guy, after completing the first expedition to the South Pole in 1911, Amundsen sailed to Hobart in Tasmania to announce his success. So that's Amundsen. When we look at it, Fun with Maps fact here, Tasmania lies at similar latitudes to the South Island of New Zealand and parts of Patagonia in South America. If you flipped it, though, on the equator, relative to the northern hemisphere, it's at a similar latitude to Hokkaido in Japan, Manchuria in northeast China, the North Mediterranean Sea in Europe, and the Canada-U.S. border, actually. This is a picture by Tony Cannon. It's the Aurora Australis at Mortimer Bay Nature Reserve in Tasmania. So, in the northern hemisphere here, we have something called the Aurora Borealis, or the Northern Lights. If you're near the South Pole, it's called an Aurora Australis, or the Southern Lights. And because Tasmania has that proximity to the South Magnetic Pole towards Antarctica, sometimes you can see the Aurora Australis from Tasmania. So Tasmania is so geographically and biologically isolated. That means it's got a lot of unique endemic flora and fauna. It has many types of animals found on mainland Australia, but some of these species, like the platypus, are larger than the mainland relative. This is a picture from a zoo in Hobart in 1910. This is a family of thylacines. Okay, Tasmania was home to this marsupial called a thylacine, but more commonly known as the Tasmanian tiger. As you can see, look at these stripes. Unfortunately, it became extinct in mainland Australia much earlier. It competed with the dingo, and now it's extinct on Tasmania too. But that's the thylacine or Tasmanian tiger, and of course, that leads us to the famous Tasmanian devil. That became the largest carnivorous marsupial in the world following the extinction of these poor thylacines in 1936. They are only found in the wild in Tasmania. This is an impression made in 1808 actually by someone named George Harris, and up here you have the Tasmanian devil, and down here you have the Tasmanian tiger or the thylacine. So that was back in 1808, the Tasmanian devil, and here's that Tasmanian tiger. So the Tasmanian devil up here, they'll also call it a Tassie devil. It's carnivorous, it's a marsupial, and marsupials are like kangaroos, wallabies, koalas, wombats, a lot of things we associate Australia with. It was once native to mainland Australia, but right now only found in the island of Tasmania. Someone named Peter Shanks uploaded this road sign in Tasmania. We may have deer crossing or squirrels or armadillo or whatever, but here in Tasmania, drivers are alerted to the presence of Tasmanian devils near the road. That's pretty cool. So how they got their name, early European settlers, they heard this frightening and almost unearthly noise coming from the bush, and then they'd see these little animals with these big sharp teeth, making that noise, so they called it the devil. This is a great picture by J.J. Harrison. It's Tasmania's state animal, and that's just the Tasmanian devil. That's a nice picture. They're on the endangered list, unfortunately. For over 100 years, they were trapped and poisoned. They were considered to be a pest. But finally, in 1941, they were protected by a law, and now the Tassie devils are very much alive in the wild. Especially like in Cradle Mountain National Park, you can see them coming out after sunset there. This is a classic picture. It's fair use from brandsoftworld.com. Many of us know about the Tasmanian devil from the cartoons, and unlike the cartoons, they do not spin. They can climb trees and swim. They're protective. They can be quite aggressive if they're feeding on a carcass. They've got the wide mouth. They have a gaping snarl. It's mostly to cause fear, but their bite per unit body mass is about 540 kilograms per square inch, so that could gnaw through some metal. So some of the cartoon was based on reality, but no spinning, remember that. So the cartoon character Tasmanian devil is commonly referred to as Taz. It's animated from Warner Brothers, Looney Tunes, Merry Melodies, series of cartoons. There are only about 5 shorts before Warner Brothers Cartoons shut it down in 1964, but marketing and television appearances have propelled Taz to new popularity starting in the 1990s. So who would have thought, watching the Tasmanian devil cartoons as a kid, that there's such a rich history in this fascinating island. It seems so exotic, the whole story of Van Diemen's Land and the convicts going there. It's so far south, the unique flora and fauna, the Tasmanian devil, Tasmanian tiger, all that. It's really one for the bucket list to visit. Until then, I'm really happy that my longtime friend Ash Nalawala, he lives in Melbourne. He joined me for a discussion about Tasmania. He's visited, spent a lot of time in Hobart, the capital, and some other places. So Ash gives us, we have a conversation. He gives us some interesting perspectives. In Melbourne, it's just 150 miles away or so. So we have a separate video, part 2 of this Fun with Maps episode about Tasmania, which is the conversation with Ash Nalawala. So I hope you watch that. I think it's really interesting. And as always, if you like this, please click like and consider subscribing so you never miss an episode. And let us know if there's maps you may be interested in that we haven't covered yet. We got a long list to work on, but there might be something that you're really interested in that we can take a look at. So until then, I'm your host, Dan Hansen. Keep on having fun with maps.